It was an unusually quiet morning at the Redwood Zoo, the kind of day where the usual hum of excited families and the laughter of children seemed far away, as if the animals themselves were in on the secret. Lily, pregnant with her first child and seeking a peaceful day away from the chaos of the city, had decided to spend the day at the zoo. She had no real agenda, just a desire to clear her mind and enjoy some solitude. Lily had always loved animals, and the zoo felt like the perfect escape. It wasn't too crowded on weekdays, so she wandered through the paths lined with towering trees and scattered benches where she could sit and breathe in the fresh air. She hadn't been here in years, but today felt different. There was something strangely calming about the quiet. She walked past the lion's den, where the animals paced with elegant, majestic movements. She stopped for a moment at the giraffe's pen, admiring how gracefully they moved, but her feet carried her further past the animal exhibits she had seen countless times before. It wasn't long before she found herself near the farthest corner of the zoo, a less frequented area reserved for the more exotic and sometimes dangerous creatures. It was here that the path became narrow and winding, the towering trees around her creating an almost eerie sense of isolation. Lily's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to check the message. She texted her partner that she would be back soon, but as she was about to type her reply, something caught her eye in the distance, something large, dark, and unfamiliar. Curious, Lily walked toward the figure, her steps slow and cautious. As she turned the corner, her heart skipped a beat. There, in the shaded area, stood a massive gorilla. Lily had seen gorillas before, but none like this one. This was no ordinary zoo gorilla. His size was imposing, and his posture, though calm, exuded an aura of raw power. His front was a deep, almost shimmering black, and his eyes glimmered with an unsettling intelligence. He was sitting in the middle of his pen, staring at Lily intently. She froze. The moment their eyes met, a strange tension filled the air. The gorilla didn't seem agitated, but there was something in his gaze that made Lily uneasy. It wasn't fear. No, she wasn't fearing of him. It was something else, something deeper. A quiet understanding passed between them, and without thinking, she took a step forward. The gorilla didn't move. He simply watched her, his massive hands resting on his knees, his chest rising and falling with each slow breath. Then, as though deciding something in that split second, he did something entirely unexpected. He stood up. Slowly, with deliberate movements, he approached the bars of the enclosure. Lily instinctively took a step back, but her curiosity outweighed her caution. Her eyes never left his as he reached through the bars of the cage, extending one huge arm toward her. His hand was enormous, each finger thicker than her wrist, but surprisingly gentle. Lily stood there, captivated, unable to move. The zoo staff, noticing the unusual behavior of the gorilla, began to move toward the area. The scene was becoming too unusual to ignore, but Lily's gaze was still fixed on the gorilla. Her heartbeat quickened as she felt a strange pull, something she couldn't explain. And then, in the blink of an eye, the gorilla did something that no one in the zoo could have predicted. He reached through the bars, gripped her gently but firmly by the arm, and pulled her inside the enclosure. The chaos that followed was nothing short of madness. Shouts rang through the zoo as visitors scrambled to safety, and zoo staff rushed to the scene. Lily's heart pounded as the gorilla, with astonishing strength, pulled her past the enclosure bars into the shadows of the thick jungle like habitat. She had no time to react, no time to scream or run. The gorilla's grip on her arm was firm but not painful. She tried to pull away, but his hand was like a vice. He didn't seem violent, though. In fact, his movements were slow and deliberate, as if he were guiding her somewhere. It wasn't until they were deep within the enclosure, hidden from the view of others, that Lily's panic began to set in. She realized she had no idea where she was, and more importantly, she didn't know what the gorilla wanted with her. Her mind raced. Was this a deliberate attack, or was something else going on? Why had the gorilla chosen her? Why was he so calm, so controlled, while the rest of the zoo erupted in chaos? She tried to look around, but the thick foliage around her made it hard to see much. The sounds of the zoo were muffled now, replaced by the deep, rhythmic sound of the gorilla's breathing. He seemed to be leading her into a large, rocky cave. The temperature dropped slightly as they entered, the air musty and cool. Lily felt a sense of surreal confusion, like she had stepped into a dream. The gorilla didn't seem to care for the screaming and commotion outside. Instead, he gently released her arm and moved further into the cave. Millie, still in a daze, followed. She was trapped. There was no way back. Lily's heart raced as the gorilla's massive hand gripped her forearm with surprising strength. Panic surged through her body, but her mind was oddly calm. The chaos outside the shouting of zoo staff, the cries of alarm from the visitors seemed distant now, muffled by the thick, towering trees surrounding her. She tried to pull back, but the gorilla's grip was unyielding. He didn't hurt her, but his hold was firm enough that she couldn't break free. The gorilla's eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. His gaze was intense, focused. He wasn't showing any aggression. In fact, there was a strange tenderness in his eyes, as though he were trying to communicate something. Lily's instinct told her to be afraid, but her curiosity overpowered the fear. She had seen gorillas at the zoo before, but never one like this. Never one that looked so human. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. What was happening? Why was he pulling her into this enclosure? The zoo staff had rushed to the scene, but they had no way of seeing what was going on inside the thick, dense foliage. Lily's gaze shifted nervously around the unfamiliar environment. The foliage around her was dense, and the path was winding, leading deeper into the heart of the Gilla's domain. She tried to make sense of her situation. The only thing she knew for sure was that she was no longer in the open areas of the zoo. She was somewhere deeper, isolated where the staff could not see her. As they moved further into the space, the noise of the zoo faded entirely. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves and the heavy, measured breathing of the gorilla. His hand never wavered as it gripped her, guiding her deeper into the unknown. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time in the world. It was a surreal feeling for Lily, like she was part of some bizarre dream she couldn't wake up from. They reached a large rock formation, and the gorilla stopped in front of it, turning his gaze toward her. Lily, still trying to make sense of what was happening, hesitated for a moment. The gorilla released her arm gently, his fingers brushing against her skin one last time before he stepped away. For a long moment, there was silence. The gorilla didn't speak. Neither did Lily. She stood there trying to process everything that had just happened. She wanted to run, to scream for help, but she couldn't. Something kept her rooted to the spot. A strange connection seemed to be building between them, though she couldn't explain it. The gorilla, Korg, turned and moved toward a large, dark, cave-like opening in the rock. The air grew colder, and Lily instinctively shivered, not just from the temperature, but from the overwhelming sense of isolation that now surrounded her. She glanced back at the path behind her, but there was no way to go back. No one could hear her. She was alone with him in this strange place, and she had no idea what would happen next. Lily swallowed hard and took a hesitant step forward. It was almost as though the gorilla was beckoning her, urging her to follow. She did, though her heart pounded in her chest with every step. She had to know more, had to understand why this was happening. Why had Cork taken her, and what did he want? The cave was cool and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and moss. The walls were lined with jagged rocks, and there were bits of straw and leaves scattered across the floor, remnants of the gorilla's life in this secluded space. It was primitive, yet oddly peaceful. The silence here was different, calming in a strange way. Korg walked deeper into the cave, his massive frame moving with surprising grace for such a large creature. He didn't look back at her, but Lily could feel his presence, feel his eyes on her as if he were watching her every move. Lily was torn between fear and fascination. The more she observed Korg, the more she realized that he was not acting like the other gorillas she had seen in the zoo. There was a sense of intelligence in his actions and awareness that she hadn't expected. It was as though he understood her in a way that no other animal could. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, a low, almost mournful noise that echoed through the cave. Korg turned, and for the first time, he made a sound in her presence, a deep rumble that seemed to come from deep within his chest. It wasn't threatening, it wasn't a growl or a roar. It was sad. Lily watched him carefully, her heart aching with a strange sense of empathy. She didn't know why, but she fell for him. There was something about his loneliness, the way he seemed to be searching for something, that struck her. As she stood there processing everything that had happened, she suddenly realized something important. Korg wasn't acting out of aggression. This wasn't an attack. It was something else, something more complicated. Just as that thought crossed her mind, a zoo employee, James, the senior caretaker who had worked with Korg for years, arrived at the cave entrance, his breath coming out in quick gasps. Lily heard him before she saw him, his voice calling out to Korg. "Korg!" James shouted. "Let her go. She's not a part of your—" "What are you doing, Korg?" "Let her go." Now Lily turned toward the voice, relief flooding her veins at the sight of James. But as she looked back at Korg, she noticed something even more unsettling. Korg wasn't looking at James. His attention was entirely on her. He seemed unfazed by the caretaker's presence, almost as though he didn't recognize him anymore. James stood at the entrance, confused and frightened, but determined. He had been with Korg for years, but he had never seen the gorilla act like this before. "Korg, stop." James tried again. "She's not the one you're thinking of." "You've got to understand, she's not the same as—" James's voice trailed off as Korg made a low, guttural sound, his eyes flickering toward Lily once more. The caretaker's words hung in the air, unfinished, as the silence in the cave became heavier. James's voice echoed in the cave, his words barely making a dent in the strange, silent atmosphere that had settled between Lily and Korg. The caretaker stood at the entrance, watching the two of them intently, but the gorilla's attention was still entirely on Lily. It was as though the world outside had disappeared, leaving only the two of them frozen in time, in this secluded, shadowed space. Lily could feel the weight of Korg's gaze on her, and though there was no threat in his eyes, there was a deep intensity, an unspoken connection between them that sent a shiver down her spine. On her spine. She didn't understand it. She didn't understand him. "James," she called, her voice hoarse. "What's happening?" "Why is he doing this?" James stepped forward, trying to close the distance between them, but his movements were cautious. He kept his eyes on Korg, not wanting to provoke the gorilla further. "I don't know," James admitted, "but I think I have an idea. This is something we never expected." Korg's behavior has been strange for the last few weeks, ever since. Well, ever since we moved the other female gorilla to another zoo. Lily blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" James's eyes softened, a mixture of sympathy and regret in his gaze. The zoo had to transfer one of Korg's companions. She was a female gorilla named Tara. They were closer than we ever realized. And when she was moved, Korg, he didn't handle it well. He became agitated, anxious. And now this, Lily's heart sank. She had heard the stories of how animals in captivity formed bonds with one another, bonds that were often stronger than those between humans. But she hadn't realized the depth of Korg's attachment to Tara. And now it seemed that the absence of his companion had left an emotional void, one that Korg was trying to fill. You think he wants me to be Tara? Lily's voice trembled as she spoke, the idea of it feeling surreal, almost impossible. But James didn't deny it. I think he's confused, James said quietly. He might not understand why she's gone. And when he saw you, I think he thought you were her. Or at least he hoped you were. Lily's stomach churned at the thought. She didn't know what to feel sympathy for Korg's loneliness or fear for her own safety. She had never been in a situation like this before, and every part of her body was screaming at her to run, but she couldn't. There was something about the way Korg looked at her, something in the intensity of his gaze that held her there, rooted in place. For a long moment, there was silence. James seemed to be weighing his next words carefully, as though he, too, was unsure of how to proceed. "We can't force him to let you go," James said finally. "We've tried to work with him. But Korg doesn't trust many people, and he's been acting out of grief, not malice. The problem is he doesn't know how to express that grief. And that's why he's holding you here. He's searching for something, for a connection, but it's not something that can be easily understood." Lily's mind was spinning. She had always been an empathetic person, but the situation she found herself in was beyond comprehension. Cord, the mighty gorilla, wasn't just an animal. He was a creature with emotions, with a history of loss. The weight of his grief seemed to radiate off of him, and it left Lily feeling both helpless and strangely moved. She glanced back at Korg, who was still standing in the middle of the cave, watching her with those deep, intelligent eyes. She could see the sadness in him now, something more than just the usual behavior of a captive animal. It was as if he was mourning, as if he had lost something vital. And Lily was the only one who could possibly fill that void. Lily took a deep breath, her hand instinctively reaching out toward him. She wasn't sure why. Perhaps it was the compassion that had been stirred in her by his silent grief. Or maybe it was the overwhelming sense of helplessness that had come over her. But whatever it was, she felt an undeniable pull toward Korg. She whispered softly, her voice trembling. "I'm not Tara, I can't be her, but I'm here with you." For a moment, there was no response. Korg simply stared at her, his face unreadable. But then slowly, he took a step toward her. The massive creature moved with surprising grace, his movements fluid despite his size. Lily didn't move. She stayed where she was, her heart racing as Korg approached. When he was close enough, he stopped. He didn't touch her, but his presence was overwhelming. Lily could feel the warmth radiating off of him, and she realized just how massive he truly was. Standing in front of him, she felt small, vulnerable, yet strangely safe at the same time. Korg looked down at her, and for the first time, Lily noticed something else in his eyes. There was a flicker of recognition. It wasn't Tara, but it was something. Something familiar, something human. Lily reached up, her hand trembling as she gently placed it on his arm. His fur was thick and coarse beneath her fingers, but there was a surprising softness to it. She could feel the muscles beneath his skin, the power in his frame, but she also felt the vulnerability, the raw emotion that lay just beneath the surface. For a long moment, neither of them moved. They simply stood there, locked in a silent understanding. The world outside the cave felt distant, irrelevant. In this moment, it was just Lily and Korg, a human and a gorilla, sharing a bond neither of them fully understood. Lily stood in the cave, her fingers still resting lightly on Korg's thick arm. The silence between them was profound, the air heavy with unspoken words. She could feel the warmth of his body beneath her hand, the slow rise and fall of his breath. It was surreal, this huge, powerful creature who could easily crush her with a single movement was now standing in front of her like a quiet force, almost vulnerable. Korg's eyes never left her face. There was something in them now, something like longing, but also confusion. Lily couldn't shake the feeling that despite his immense strength and intimidating presence, Korg was just as lost as she felt in that moment. Maybe even more so. He was grieving, and she was caught in the middle of it, trying to make sense of something that seemed impossible. "You're not alone," Lily whispered again, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the cave. It wasn't the words she had planned to say, it just came out, a comforting murmur meant to ease both of them. For a long time, there was no response. Korg simply stood there, his immense presence occupying the space, his gaze softening ever so slightly. Lily could see the conflict in his eyes. He was trying to reconcile the reality of Tara's absence with the presence of this stranger her. She wasn't Tara, and yet, in his confusion, she had become something else to him. She withdrew her hand slowly, stepping back just a fraction, as if giving him the space he needed to process her presence. It was clear that Korg wasn't fully aware of what he was doing, but in his state of emotional turmoil, he had latched onto her. He wanted something, but Lily had no idea how to give it to him. James stood quietly at the entrance of the cave, his posture tense. He had seen Korg's attachment to Tara firsthand, but this is different. Korg had never acted like this with anyone else. He had always been aloof, even with other gorillas, and yet here he was, drawn to Lily as though she were the missing piece of his life. James cleared his throat, his voice low. "You're doing well. It's hard for him, but don't push in too far," Lily nodded, her heart aching for Korg. "I don't want to hurt him. I just don't understand what's happening. I'm not Tara," James sighed, stepping closer to the cave entrance. He knows that, but grief doesn't always make sense. It's not logical. Animals, especially gorillas like Korg, form bonds that go deeper than we realize. Tara was his companion for years, and when she was moved, it's like a part of him was torn away. Now he's searching for something to fill that void, but he's confused and he's projecting that confusion onto you. Lily's thoughts swirled as she tried to make sense of everything James had said. She wasn't Tara, and she never could be. But it wasn't her fault that Korg was drawn to her. She could feel the pull to this strange magnetic connection between them that neither of them could explain. She wasn't sure whether to fear it or embrace it. "I don't know if I can help him," Lily said softly, her gaze still fixed on Korg, who hadn't moved from his spot. "What if I make it worse?" James shook his head. "You're not making it worse. He just needs time and space. He'll figure it out eventually," but Lily wasn't so sure. Time was a luxury she wasn't sure they had. Korg was in emotional turmoil, and every day that passed without resolution made her feel more and more uncertain about how to help him. She couldn't just leave him, not when she could see how much he needed someone to understand. Korg's eyes flickered toward James, then back to Lily. He took a tentative step forward, his large feet making no sound on the cave floor. His movements were slow, measured. He seemed to be gauging her reaction, waiting for her to respond. Lily swallowed her fear, meeting his gaze. She wasn't sure what he wanted, but she could feel the weight of his unspoken need. It was a strange, almost surreal feeling to be in the presence of such an enormous creature, to feel his pain, his longing so acutely. "It's okay, Korg," Lily said gently, her voice soft and steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Korg stopped in front of her, his head tilting slightly to one side. The intensity in his eyes was unnerving, but there was something else there now, a flicker of understanding. He wasn't just looking at her as a substitute for Tara anymore. It was as though he was beginning to see her for who she was. Lily took a slow, cautious step back, wanting to test the waters. Korg didn't move, didn't try to grab her again. Instead, he seemed to wait for her to decide what would happen next. A deep, guttural sound escaped Korg's chest, a noise that almost sounded like a sigh, a noise that almost sounded like a sigh. It wasn't a roar or a growl, but something between a lament and a relief. Lily was unsure how to interpret it, but it felt like a breakthrough. She glanced at James, who was watching the interaction closely. He didn't seem worried, but there was a look of concern on his face, concern for both Korg and Lily. "He's not going to hurt you," James said, his voice firm yet gentle. "But he doesn't know how to handle his feelings right now. You've got to take it slow. Let him lead." Lily nodded, her gaze never leaving Korg. He had been through so much already, and she couldn't turn her back on him now. Despite the tension that filled the air, there was a quiet understanding between them that she couldn't ignore. "All right," Lily whispered, taking another cautious step forward. "I'll take it slow. I won't leave you." For the first time in what felt like forever, Korg made a soft, contented noise. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to show that, in his way, he was beginning to trust her. She wasn't Tara, but for now, she was all he had. And that, in its own way, was enough. Days had passed since Lily's first real connection with Korg. Each one felt like a slow unraveling of something mysterious, something delicate. There were no words between them, only the quiet understanding that passed in glances, in gestures, and in the rare moments of calm that filled the cave. Yet, as strange as it was, Lily couldn't deny that there was a strange kind of comfort in being near Korg in his presence. The bond they were forming, though unconventional, seemed to be growing stronger by the day. James had continued his watchful distance, offering words of caution but rarely stepping too close. He had seen how Korg had behaved with the other staff, how Korg had grown accustomed to their presence, but he had never witnessed anything like this. Lily, however, had been different. She had become the one thing Korg couldn't understand yet in his confusion. She had become the thing he sought out the most. Lily's mind still raced with questions. She had been brought here to observe, to study Korg's behavior, to understand his grief, but somewhere along the way, the lines had blurred. Korg had stopped being just an animal to her. He had become something else, something far more complex. The cave was now her world, as it was Korg's. It was quiet, isolated, and untouched by the outside. When Lily walked into the space now, it felt different. Her heart no longer raced in fear. Instead, she felt a sense of duty, a sense of responsibility to this creature that had been so alone, so confused, and so desperately seeking connection. On this particular day, as the afternoon light filtered into the cave, Lily noticed something different about Korg. He was pacing, his heavy footsteps echoing in the stone. The deep growls that had been a constant hum were absent. He seemed restless. "Korg?" Lily called softly, but the gorilla didn't respond. His movements were jerky, uncertain, and his large eyes were fixed on something beyond her. He was agitated, and Lily could feel the tension in the air. She stepped forward cautiously, not wanting to alarm him, but her concern grew when she noticed how far he had strayed from his usual spot. It wasn't like him to be so erratic, to move around without purpose. "Korg," Lily said again, this time more firmly. "What's wrong?" But Korg didn't look at her. He continued to pace back and forth, grunting intermittently as he looked out toward the narrow opening of the cave. Lily hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. Something had shifted. Korg had always been an enigma, but now he seemed even more distant, more untethered. Suddenly, Korg stopped in his tracks. He turned his head toward the entrance of the cave, his eyes narrowing as though he had sensed something. Lily froze, her breath catching in her throat. There was a low, ominous rumble from the distance, a sound that was unsettling in the stillness of the cave. She turned slowly to James, who had appeared in the mouth of the cave. He looked uneasy, his gaze flicking between Lily and Korg. "It's the others," James said quietly. "The staff, they're coming." Lily's heart sank. She had been so caught up in Korg's grief and the growing connection between them that she had lost track of time. She hadn't realized that the staff would be checking on Korg today. And now, seeing Korg's reaction, she feared that the visit would only exacerbate his anxiety. "They can't be here," Lily whispered urgently. "He won't understand." James looked grim. "We've been monitoring him closely, but if we don't let them in, if we don't follow protocol, they'll start asking questions. Korg is already unpredictable. If we don't let them in, he might get more agitated. We have no choice." The words hit Lily like a blow. She understood the necessity of keeping the zoo's operations intact, of following procedure, but Korg wasn't just any animal. He had become something more to her, something personal. And now, with the arrival of the staff, everything she had been trying to build with Korg felt like it was slipping through her fingers. Korg's growls deepened, and he began to move again. He was anxious, pacing faster now, the anger and confusion swirling around him like a storm. Lily could see the distress in his eyes, and her heart ached. She couldn't let this happen, not when they were finally starting to understand each other. She stepped forward, placing herself between Korg and the cave entrance. She didn't know what she was doing, but something inside of her refused to let Korg face whatever the staff had planned without her being there. She reached out, placing a hand on Korg's massive arm once again. "Korg," she whispered, her voice low and steady. "It's okay." "I'm here." For a brief moment, Korg paused, his gaze flicking down to where her hand rested on his arm. His body was still tense, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he seemed to hesitate as though searching her face for some kind of reassurance. Lily held his gaze, her heart racing. She didn't know what he was thinking, but for the first time since meeting him, she felt like they were truly communicating. His anxiety wasn't just a reaction to the staff, it was his fear of being abandoned again, his fear of losing the one connection he had. Just then, the sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance, and Lily turned to see the staff members walking toward them. Walking toward them. There were three of them, two veterinarians, and a senior keeper moving with purpose, their eyes focused on Korg. Lily felt a surge of protectiveness rise within her, but she knew she couldn't keep them away. She stepped back slightly, her hand still resting on Korg's arm. She didn't want to interfere with the staff's work, but she couldn't let Korg be left alone in this state. "Not now." "Korg," Lily said softly, her voice trembling with the emotion she felt. "Please trust me. I am not going anywhere." The girl's gaze softened, just a fraction, as though he understood. But the tension in his body remained, and as the staff came closer, he stepped back, his eyes still locked on Lily. She could see the conflict within him, his desire for connection, warring with his fear of being betrayed again. The staff members stopped just short of them, observing the interaction with interest. James stepped forward, his tone calm but firm. "It's all right, Lily. Let's let them do their work." Lily hesitated but nodded, stepping aside slightly to allow the staff to approach. She still kept her hand on Korg's arm, offering him what little comfort she could. The staff members moved in carefully, talking softly to Korg as they approached. But Lily couldn't shake the feeling that Korg was more than just an animal to them now. He had become something else, entirely a creature who was grieving, confused, and searching for something that she couldn't quite put into words. As the staff worked, Korg remained still, his gaze occasionally flicking to Lily as if reassured by her presence. It was a small victory, but for Lily, it was enough. She knew that no matter what happened, she couldn't let Korg face this alone again. The days following the staff's visit to the cave were tense. Lily could feel the subtle shift in the air, the weight of the unspoken between her and Korg. The Z staff had left after conducting their usual rounds, but the damage had been done. Korg had retreated once again into his isolated world, and the small progress they had made seemed to be slipping away. For the first time, Lily felt unsure of how to proceed. Her role as a researcher and an observer had become entangled with something much more personal. The emotions she had been trying to keep at bay were no longer something she could ignore. Korg wasn't just an animal to her, he was becoming something she couldn't define. She was no longer just studying him, she was trying to understand him, to reach him on some deeper level that no one else seemed to be able to access. It had been 2 weeks since the incident with the staff, and Lily had come to the cave every day, trying to bridge the widening gap between them. Karg's behavior was erratic one moment. He would sit quietly in the corner of his cave, eyes dull with sadness, and the next he would be pacing, growling, or staring out toward the mouth of the cave, as if waiting for something or someone. Lily's frustration was mounting. Every day felt like an uphill battle. She had been trying to understand Korg's grief, trying to piece together the trauma he had suffered when his companion, the female gorilla, had been moved away. But the more she observed, the more she realized that Korg's emotional state wasn't just about that. There was something else, something that neither she nor the staff had fully grasped. Lily sat on a large stone near the entrance of the cave, her legs tucked beneath her. She watched as Korg sat in the far corner, his massive form hunched over, his usual strength seemed diminished, as if the weight of his emotions was too much for him to bear. She could feel the pull of his loneliness, the yearning in his eyes, and for the first time, she wondered if there was something she could do to help him beyond just being there. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. James appeared, his face etched with concern. He had been monitoring Korg's behavior as usual, but there was an unease in his expression that Lily hadn't seen before. "Lily," James said, his voice low, "we need to talk." She turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat. "What is it?" James hesitated before answering, his eyes flicking to where Korg sat in the corner. The higher ups have made a decision. They're talking about transferring Korg to another facility. They think his behavior is becoming unpredictable, and they don't know how much longer we can keep him here. Lily's breath caught in her throat. "What?" "No, they can't," she stopped herself, the weight of his words sinking in. She had known on some level that this day might come. But hearing it out loud felt like a punch to the gut. "I've been fighting for him," James continued, his voice tight with frustration. "But the decision's been made. If we don't act quickly, they'll send him away in a matter of days." Lily stood up, her mind racing. She couldn't let that happen. She had seen what Korg had become when he was alone, when there was no one to understand him, no one to offer him even the slightest bit of comfort. Sending him away would only make things worse. "No," she said firmly. "I'm not letting them take him." James looked at her, his face unreadable. "Lily, you have to understand. Korg is a danger to himself. He's not the same gorilla he used to be. And if we don't send him to a more specialized facility, we could be putting everyone at risk. We can't let personal attachment get in the way of what's best for him or for everyone here." Lily's heart ached. She could feel the pull of her emotions, her attachment to Korg growing stronger by the day. That she knew James was right, as much as she didn't want to admit it, there was a limit to what she could do. She had no real power to change the zoo's decisions, but there was still one thing she could try. "James," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. "I think I understand what's happening with him. It's not just the loss of his companion, it's the way he's been treated. The isolation, the lack of real connection. He needs more than just care. He needs someone who understands him, James shook his head, his expression softening. I wish it were that simple, Lily, but we're talking about a wild animal, not a human being. There's a reason he's been kept in isolation. He can't be treated like a pet. I know, she said, her voice steady now, but I think there's a way to help him, a way to reach him. We can't just give up on him because it's convenient. James exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. What do you propose we do? Lily thought for a long moment, her gaze turning to Korg. She could see the sadness in his eyes, the way his massive body seemed to sag with the weight of his emotions. He was so lost, so alone, and she couldn't bear the thought of him being torn away from the only place he had ever known, the only place where he might still have a chance at healing. I want to try something, she said, her voice filled with determination. I want to spend more time with him. I want to see if I can help him process his emotions. If I can build that bond, maybe we can avoid the transfer. Maybe he'll be able to heal. James looked at her for a long time, then sighed. All right, but if things get worse, you have to promise me you'll let the staff step in. We can't risk anyone getting hurt. Lily nodded. She knew what she was asking for was a long shot, but she couldn't just walk away without at least trying. For Cord and for herself, she had to see this through. As James walked away, Lily turned back to face Korg. The gorilla looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mix of confusion and longing. She could see the small flicker of recognition in his gaze, the faint hope that she might be the one to finally break through the wall he had built around himself. Slowly, Lily approached him. She didn't speak at first, just knelt in front of him, her eyes soft and reassuring. She had no idea what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't let Korg be abandoned again. Not now, not ever. Don't worry, Korg, she whispered. I won't leave you.